expand it for the sake of capacity in terms of being able to run more trains, being able to run faster trains, and being able to run trains on more reliable schedules, you're going to continue to see a deterioration in the ability to operate passenger trains, not only on an expanded basis, but simply running what you have on time. Amtrak over the past 6 to 9 months has experienced a terrible difficulty in running its existing long-distance fleet on time. There simply aren't enough tracks to be able to allow the freight railroads to run their trains on any kind of a schedule, and to be able to keep the Amtrak trains on schedule as well.
The ability of the railroads, of the railroad infrastructure, to handle this enormous surge in new business that developed following deregulation and following the movement of so much of our manufacturing offshore, and following the EPA's decision to require low sulfur coal in power plants, swamped the railroads.
The problem we face today of not having nearly enough capacity not only to move freight around this country, but to run existing passenger services like Amtrak, and to expand those services for corridors that states have chosen to invest in order to bring about intercity travel through state corridor routes.
Amtrak's Northeast Corridor is the crown jewel. Going from Boston to New York down to Washington, D.C., it's probably the most impressive. It's certainly the fastest piece of passenger railroading in the United States, North America for that matter. Amtrak runs frequent service. When people say, why can't U.S. trains be more like European trains? This is the place where they are like European trains. Fast service, dependable service, on-time performance.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention for one moment, please? Just to inform you on the reason we're stopped here at the old Sanford station is we're having air conditioning problems with one of our sleeping cars.
When locomotives or passenger cars break down, they may not have the mechanical personnel to fix those cars. That was witness your stop at Sanford.
Amtrak's equipment once again is getting old, but they have, it's now 20 years since Amtrak bought its new equipment. So it's hardly new equipment anymore.
Most people don't stop to think about Amtrak as a part of railroad history. It's more like it's something out of current events. But the fact of the matter is, when you stop to realize it, Amtrak's been around since the spring of 1971, and that's well over 30 years. It's been around for over about a third of a century, and about something like 1/6 or 1/7 of railroad history.
America created the finest rail passenger system in the world at great cost to the taxpayer. From the Transcontinental Railroad up until the end of World War II, this was the backbone of America's transportation system.
Well, 1949 is actually a good year to start, and the reason for that is because this was the year that the California Zephyr was launched. That train was the epitome of rail travel. 5 dome cars gave passengers a breathtaking view of the Rockies one day, the Sierras the next. It was what every passenger train might aspire to want to be. It was just beautiful. 1949 was also the year that the whole network of passenger rail in the U.S. shrunk by about 10,000 route miles. It had been 157,000 in 1949. That dropped 10,000 miles to 146,000 in 1950. Fast forward 10 years to 1960, the network is now at 94,000 miles, and people are starting to wonder, where did my passenger trains go? At first it was the small branch lines, 2-car trains going on branch lines here and there. People who were in corridors that had several trains might have noticed their frequencies reduced. But there wasn't a lot. If you were in one area, you wouldn't know that this was happening all over the country. The first people to ask this question was, what's going on here, was Trains magazine editor David P. Morgan. And he did it in an issue of the magazine in April of 1959, where he posed the question, who shot the passenger train? What he found was that there was a convergence of factors that were intersecting, that were basically making the passenger train no longer able to be a profit-making entity. Morgan also found that labor costs were rising. A passenger train like the California Zephyr would need more than about 70 people to staff the train from one end to another. Taxation was a huge issue too. Railroads had big city train stations, small town depots. They had to pay property taxes on it. Any improvement you wanted to make made the value of the property go up. You were assessed at a larger rate.
In 1958 was really, in my view, looking back in history, the turning point for railroad passenger service, because one, the jet, Boeing came out with the 707, Douglas came out with the DC-8, and instead of 39 3/4 hours, it became 3 3/4 hours to Chicago. And the businessman for whom time is essential began to desert us. And you almost have to say, having to get from one place to the other, having to want to be home with your family, you can sympathize. And the automobile, of course, 1958, President Eisenhower signed the Interstate Highway Act. And immediately, instead of 6 hours to Reno from the Bay Area, it became 3. Because the railroad has, the Southern Pacific line goes over Donner and it's 35 miles an hour. And then the Interstate Commerce Act was changed so that railroads could get out of the passenger business a lot easier. And that was, 58 to me was the 3 strikes and you're almost out.
We have now had more than 2 generations of American railroad managers which have been trained to manage for decline. There's been an assumption since shortly after the end of World War II that the railroad business would decline, the passenger business did decline, the freight business declined. Following 1956, when the federal government started to build the interstate highways, there was an enormous slump in railroad shipments. The American economy grew like this, the railroad economy grew like this. And the result was the railroads started to plan for a slimmer future.
If you make an investment like the Eisenhower administration began back in the 50s with the interstate highway system, that's pretty much going to dictate not only how people are going to travel, but how people are going to live, how you're going to have suburban sprawl and expansion. When you make transportation available for little or no money to be able to utilize a private automobile to get from point A to point B, and way back when fuel prices were so inexpensive to not matter, it became a pretty easy choice for the traveling public to utilize automobiles and to gravitate away from using passenger trains.
It got to the point, though, in the 1950s and 60s, with heavily subsidized competition, largely in the form of the interstate highway system and cheap gasoline, that people took to the roads on these, in their private automobiles, and were abandoning passenger trains at the time. And this pushed several of those private railroads to the brink of bankruptcy. In fact, some were in bankruptcy, and that's what accelerated the federal permission for them to drop their service.
In 1967, the AAR found that the total amount paid by 58 railroads involved in passenger service amounted to $485 million. We're talking about nearly $500 million that railroads were paying themselves to cover the losses of the passenger trains they were being expected to run. That same year, highways, airports, pipelines got public money of $20 billion. $6 billion of that came from the federal government alone. So for a freight railroad industry to be asked to spend upwards of $500 million a year to cover these passenger trains was just sapping. You weren't just talking about the discontinuance of passenger trains now, you were talking about an issue that was affecting the health of the entire railroad industry. This got the federal government's attention. They had been dithering around wondering whether or not